The dark tale of the Messerschmitt Me-323 Gigant begins in 1940, when Nazi Germany faced a monumental challenge that would ultimately doom this colossal machine to become one of World War II's most spectacular failures. But what made this aircraft both revolutionary and fatally vulnerable? The answer lies in a deadly combination of ambitious engineering and catastrophic strategic miscalculations that would cost hundreds of lives and seal the fate of the Third Reich's most massive flying machine. In the autumn of 1940, as German forces swept across Europe, military planners were already looking ahead to their next impossible target, Great Britain. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, demanded something unprecedented in military aviation history. The existing DFS-230 light gliders had proven their worth during the daring assault on Fort Eben-Emael in Belgium, marking the world's first ever glider-borne military assault. However, crossing the English Channel would require far more than small assault teams. The Wehrmacht needed to airlift entire tank units, heavy artillery pieces, and thousands of troops in a single devastating wave. On October 18, 1940, both Junkers and Messerschmitt received an almost impossible deadline. Just 14 days to design a transport glider capable of carrying either an 88mm gun with its half-track tractor or an entire Panzer IV medium tank weighing over 25 tons or 11,360 kilograms. This wasn't just ambitious engineering, it was military desperation wrapped in technical specifications. Junkers responded with the Ju-322 Mammoth, an all-wooden giant that reached prototype form but quickly proved to be an engineering disaster. The aircraft suffered from catastrophic instability during its first test flight, and the high-grade timber required for its construction was becoming increasingly scarce as the war expanded. The project was scrapped, leaving Messerschmitt as the sole contender. Messerschmitt's design went through multiple designations, initially called the Me-261W, then changed to Me-263, and finally settling on Me-321. This would become the foundation for what aviation historians now consider the largest land-based transport aircraft ever built. However, the Me-321 glider itself was nearly as dangerous to its own crew as it was ambitious in scope. The unpowered Me-321 required an extraordinary takeoff procedure that bordered on controlled chaos. 3 Messerschmitt Bf-110 fighter aircraft were needed as towplanes, supplemented by rocket-assisted takeoff units strapped to the glider's wings. This complex arrangement led to numerous fatal accidents as pilots struggled to coordinate the powerful, unstable combination during takeoff. The massive glider was simply too large and heavy for safe glider operations, yet the German military pressed forward with an even more audacious plan. From this dangerous foundation emerged the Me-323 Gigant in 1941, transformed from an unpowered glider into a 6-engine transport aircraft. The conversion involved mounting 6 Gnome Rhone 14 and 14-cylinder air-cooled radial engines, 3 under each wing. These French-manufactured engines, producing 1,164 horsepower or 868 kilowatts each, were chosen not for their superiority, but out of necessity. German industry was already stretched to its limits, so engines from occupied France had to suffice. The resulting aircraft was truly gigantic by any standard. With a wingspan of 181 feet, 1 inch, or 55.2 meters, a length of 92 feet 6 inches, or 28.2 meters, and a height of 33 feet 4 inches, or 10.15 meters, the Me-323 dwarfed every other transport aircraft of its era. Its empty weight of 60,252 pounds, or 27,330 kilograms, could increase to a maximum takeoff weight of 94,799 pounds, or 43,000 kilograms when fully loaded. The cargo capacity was equally impressive and terrifying. The aircraft could transport 130 fully equipped soldiers, or alternatively, carry between 22,000 to 26,500 pounds, or 10,000 to 12,000 kilograms of military equipment. The cargo hold measured 36 feet, or 11 meters in length, 10 feet, or 3 meters in width, and 11 feet, or 3.4 meters in height. This cavernous space could accommodate everything from multiple trucks and artillery pieces to medical equipment and ammunition supplies. Yet for all its impressive specifications, the ME-323 was fundamentally flawed from an operational standpoint. Despite its 6 engines, the aircraft could barely manage a maximum speed of 177 miles per hour or 285 kilometers per hour. Its cruise speed was even more pedestrian at 135 miles per hour or 218 kilometers per hour. The service ceiling of just 13,000 feet or 4,000 meters meant it couldn't climb high enough to avoid most fighter interceptions, and its range of only 500 miles or 800 kilometers severely limited operational flexibility. The aircraft's defensive armament seemed formidable on paper, but proved inadequate in practice. Various models carried multiple 7.9 2mm MG-15 or MG-81 machine guns, supplemented by 13mm MG-131 heavy machine guns. Some variants even featured 2 HDL-151 turrets equipped with devastating 20mm cannons mounted on the upper wing surfaces. However, this firepower couldn't compensate for the aircraft's fundamental vulnerability. It was simply too large, too slow, and too unmaneuverable to survive in contested airspace. Production of the ME-323 began in earnest in 1942, with manufacturing continuing until April 1944. Different sources provide conflicting production numbers, but most historians agree that between 198 and 210 aircraft were completed. Additionally, several ME-321 gliders were converted to powered ME-323 configuration, adding to the total fleet size. Production included several variants, beginning with the D-1 model and progressing through D and E series aircraft, with improvements to aerodynamics, defensive armament, structural strength, and fuel capacity. The ME-323 saw its most extensive and ultimately most tragic service in 2 primary theaters, the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union and the Mediterranean theater supporting German forces in North Africa. It was in this latter theater that the aircraft's fundamental vulnerabilities would be exposed in the most catastrophic manner possible. By 1942, the situation in North Africa had become desperate for the Deutsches Afrika-Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Allied naval forces had made traditional shipping routes across the Mediterranean increasingly perilous. British submarines and surface vessels operating from their stronghold in Malta were intercepting and destroying Axis convoy after convoy. Between June and September 1941 alone, British forces sank 108 Axis ships, totaling 300,000 gross registered tons. The loss rate was staggering. In November 1941, Axis fuel losses amounted to 49,365 tons out of 79,208 tons shipped. Faced with this maritime stranglehold, the Luftwaffe turned to massive airlift operations to keep Rommel's forces supplied. The ME-323 became the backbone of this desperate effort, beginning operations in the Tunisian campaign in September 1942 and expanding into full Mediterranean theater service by November. These giant transports carried everything the Afrika Korps needed to survive: ammunition, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies, and replacement personnel. However, the same factors that made the ME-323 invaluable as a transport aircraft made it incredibly vulnerable to enemy action. Its massive size made it impossible to hide, while its slow speed and poor maneuverability turned every flight into a potential death sentence for its crew. The situation became even more perilous as Allied fighter strength in the Mediterranean grew throughout 1942 and early 1943. The aircraft's operational challenges were compounded by the nature of Mediterranean geography. Flights from Italian bases to North African destinations required long overwater transits, exposing the slow-moving transports to interception for extended periods. Even with fighter escorts, usually provided by Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters from Jagdgeschwader 27, the fundamental mismatch between the lumbering transports and agile Allied fighters created impossible tactical situations. British, South African, and American fighter pilots quickly learned to exploit the Me-323's vulnerabilities. Supermarine Spitfire and Curtiss P-40 Kitty Hawk fighters could easily outmaneuver the massive transports, attacking from multiple angles simultaneously. The transport's defensive guns, while numerous, couldn't provide adequate coverage against coordinated attacks from fast-moving fighters. Even when gunners managed to engage attacking aircraft, the transport's own size and slow speed made evasive action virtually impossible. The strategic situation deteriorated rapidly throughout 1943 as Allied air power in the Mediterranean reached overwhelming strength. Malta, despite constant German bombing, remained operational as a British base, providing a perfect position for intercepting Axis transport flights. Allied intelligence, enhanced by ultra-intercepts of German communications, often provided advance warning of transport missions, allowing fighters to position themselves for maximum effectiveness. The inevitable catastrophe came during what Allied pilots would later call the Palm Sunday Massacre on April 22, 1943. A formation of 27 fully loaded Me-323 transports, escorted by Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters from Jagdgeschwader 27, was crossing the Sicilian Straits when disaster struck. 7 squadrons of Allied fighters, including Supermarine Spitfires from No. 1 Squadron South African Air Force and Curtiss P-40 Kitty Hawks from No. 7 South African Wing, intercepted the massive formation. The engagement began badly and only got worse for the German transport crews. As the formation approached the African coast near the island of Zembra, an unexpected encounter with a large group of Junkers Ju-52 transports flying in the opposite direction forced the Me-323 pilots to maneuver to avoid collision. Given the enormous size of the Me-323 aircraft, maintaining formation during such maneuvers was extremely difficult. The formation broke apart, with individual transports scattered across the sky. The escorting Bf-109 pilots, confused by the sudden formation changes, moved away from their charges at precisely the wrong moment. It was then that the Allied fighters struck with devastating effect. In the ensuing air battle, 14 to 17 of the giant transport planes were shot down, representing over half the entire formation. The massacre continued for hours as individual Me-323 aircraft, separated from their escorts and unable to evade the much faster Allied fighters, were systematically hunted down and destroyed. The losses were not just numerical, but represented a catastrophic blow to German logistics capabilities. Each destroyed Me-323 carried tons of desperately needed supplies, from ammunition and fuel to replacement parts and medical equipment. More importantly, the experienced transport crews were irreplaceable resources. Training pilots to handle the massive, complex Me-323 required months of specialized instruction, and losing so many experienced crews in a single day effectively crippled the transport fleet's operational effectiveness. Similar massacres followed throughout 1943, earning names like the Holy Thursday Massacre as Allied fighters continued to intercept and destroy Me-323 formations. The pattern was always the same. The massive transports, despite their escorts and defensive armament, simply couldn't survive against coordinated attacks by faster, more maneuverable fighters. Their size, which made them so useful as cargo carriers, made them unmissable targets. Their slow speed meant they couldn't outrun attacking fighters, while their poor maneuverability prevented effective evasive action. The strategic impact extended far beyond the immediate loss of aircraft and crews. As ME-323 losses mounted, the entire Axis position in North Africa became untenable. Rommel's Africa Corps, already stretched to breaking point by fuel and ammunition shortages, found their situation becoming hopeless as their aerial supply line collapsed. The massive investment in ME-323 production and operations had not only failed to solve the supply crisis, but had actually accelerated the collapse by concentrating scarce aviation resources in vulnerable, high-value targets. On the Eastern Front, ME-323 operations faced different but equally severe challenges. The vast distances involved in supporting German forces deep inside the Soviet Union pushed the aircraft's limited range to its absolute limits. Operating from bases in Poland and East Prussia, the transports struggled to reach forward airfields near the front lines, often requiring intermediate fuel stops that exposed them to Soviet air attacks. Soviet fighter pilots proved just as capable of exploiting the ME-323's vulnerabilities as their Western allies. WWII and Lavochkin L.A. fighters regularly intercepted the slow-moving transports, while Soviet anti-aircraft defenses became increasingly effective as the war progressed. The harsh Russian winter added another layer of complexity, with mechanical failures becoming common as the French-manufactured engines struggled with extreme cold conditions. The aircraft's operational limitations became even more apparent as the war situation deteriorated for Germany. By 1944, Allied air superiority was virtually complete in most theaters, making daylight transport operations suicidal. Night flying offered some protection, but significantly reduced navigational accuracy and increased the risk of accidents. The ME-323, with its massive size and multiple engines, was particularly vulnerable to mechanical failures during night operations. Perhaps most tragically, the ME-323's career coincided with Germany's transition from offensive to defensive operations. While the aircraft had been conceived for assault glider operations supporting bold invasions, it ended up serving primarily in desperate supply missions to surrounded or retreating German forces. Instead of carrying assault troops across the English Channel, it found itself ferrying supplies to doomed garrisons in North Africa and the Soviet Union. The aircraft's design philosophy, emphasizing cargo capacity over survivability, reflected the overconfident German strategic thinking of 1940 and 1941. Military planners assumed air superiority would be maintained, making the transport's vulnerabilities acceptable trade-offs for its impressive cargo capacity. By the time these assumptions proved fatally incorrect, it was too late to redesign the aircraft or develop effective countermeasures. Production ceased in April 1944, as the strategic situation made continued ME-323 operations impossible. The remaining aircraft were gradually withdrawn from frontline service, with some being used for training purposes, while others were converted for different roles. However, the fundamental problems that made the aircraft vulnerable to fighter attack could not be solved through modifications or tactical changes. The final operational missions of the ME-323 were characterized by increasing desperation and declining effectiveness. Crews knew they were flying death traps, but military necessity demanded continued operations, even as losses mounted. The psychological toll on transport crews was enormous, with many developing what would now be recognized as combat stress reactions. Flying a slow, unmaneuverable aircraft into contested airspace required extraordinary courage, especially when survival rates continued to plummet. By the war's end in May 1945, not a single ME-323 remained operational. The entire production run of approximately 200 aircraft had been destroyed, representing one of the most complete equipment losses of any major aircraft type in World War II. Unlike other German aircraft types that survived in small numbers or were captured intact by Allied forces, the Me-323's operational requirements ensured that virtually all examples were lost in combat or destroyed to prevent capture. The physical remnants of this massive aircraft program are remarkably scarce today. The Luftwaffenmuseum der Bundeswehr near Berlin holds a single Me-323 main wing spar in its collection, one of the few surviving structural components from the entire program. This single piece of metal represents all that remains above ground of one of the most ambitious transport aircraft projects in aviation history. However, in 2012, marine archaeologists made a remarkable discovery that provided a haunting glimpse into the Me-323's final moments. Near La Maddalena, an island close to Sardinia, Italy, a complete but ruined Me-323 wreck was located on the Mediterranean seabed. The aircraft lies in approximately 200 feet or 61 meters of water, about 8 nautical miles or 15 kilometers from the coast. This underwater tomb tells the story of July 26, 1943, when the aircraft was shot down by a British Bristol Beaufighter long-range fighter while en route from Sardinia to Pistoia in Italy. The giant transport, carrying its crew and cargo of war materials, plunged into the Mediterranean and has remained there for over 8 decades. The wreck site has become an underwater museum, a silent testament to the futility of the Me-323 program and the lives lost in its operation. The discovery revealed remarkable details about the aircraft's final moments. Evidence suggests the Beaufighter's attack damaged the transport's tail section, making controlled flight impossible. Some crew members may have survived the initial impact and attempted to escape using emergency rafts, but others perished in the flames that engulfed the aircraft as it sank. The wreck itself remains largely intact due to the depth and conditions on the Mediterranean seabed, providing researchers with unprecedented insights into the aircraft's construction and final moments. The La Maddalena wreck represents more than just an archaeological curiosity. It symbolizes the ultimate failure of the Me-323 program and the broader strategic miscalculations that characterized German military planning. The aircraft that was supposed to carry assault troops across the English Channel instead became a coffin beneath the Mediterranean waves, its crew joining the thousands of other Germans who died trying to maintain impossible supply lines to doomed military positions. The story of the Messerschmitt Me-323 Gigant encompasses both the ambitious engineering capabilities of wartime Germany and the strategic blindness that ultimately doomed the Third Reich. The aircraft represented a genuine technological achievement, the largest land-based transport aircraft ever built, capable of carrying unprecedented cargo loads across significant distances. Its designers and builders successfully solved enormous technical challenges, creating a flying machine that could transport entire tank crews, heavy artillery pieces, and massive quantities of supplies. Yet this technical success was overshadowed by fundamental strategic failures that made the aircraft's capabilities irrelevant. The assumption that air superiority could be maintained long enough for such vulnerable transports to operate effectively proved catastrophically wrong. The decision to prioritize cargo capacity over survivability reflected a military leadership that fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern aerial warfare. The human cost of these miscalculations was enormous. Hundreds of aircrew members died flying Me-323 missions, not in glorious combat, but in desperate supply runs to failing military positions. These men, many of them experienced pilots and flight engineers, represented irreplaceable human resources that Germany could ill afford to lose. Their deaths in the cockpits of doomed transport aircraft symbolized the broader waste of human life that characterized the later years of World War II. The Me-323 program also represented a massive misallocation of scarce industrial resources. The materials, engines, and manufacturing capacity devoted to building 200 of these vulnerable giants could have been used for other purposes that might have had greater military impact. The 6 French engines required for each aircraft could have powered multiple fighter aircraft, while the steel and aluminum used in construction could have supported other critical military projects. From a technological perspective, the ME-323 pushed the boundaries of what was possible with 1940s aviation technology. The engineering challenges of creating a 6-engine transport aircraft with such massive cargo capacity required innovative solutions to problems of structural strength, weight distribution, and flight control. The aircraft's designers successfully created a flying machine that could carry loads previously thought impossible for aircraft of that era. However, the technological achievement was undermined by the changing nature of aerial warfare. The air superiority battles of 1940 and 1941, which saw German fighters dominating European skies, gave way to the massive Allied air offensives of 1943 and 1944. In this new environment, survivability became more important than cargo capacity, and the ME-323's impressive load-carrying ability became irrelevant if the aircraft couldn't reach its destination intact. The aircraft's service life also coincided with the maturation of Allied fighter tactics and technology. Early warfighters like the Hurricane and early model Spitfire might have struggled to effectively attack such a heavily defended transport, but by 1943, improved aircraft like the Spitfire Mark IX and P-40 Kitty Hawk possessed the performance and firepower needed to destroy even heavily armed transports. Allied pilots had also developed effective tactics for attacking transport formations, using coordinated attacks from multiple directions to overwhelm defensive gun positions. The intelligence war also worked against the ME-323 operations. Allied code-breaking efforts, particularly the Ultra program that decrypted German communications, often provided advance warning of transport missions. This intelligence advantage allowed Allied fighters to position themselves optimally for intercept missions, turning what should have been routine supply flights into carefully orchestrated ambushes. The psychological impact of ME-323 losses extended far beyond the transport squadrons themselves. German ground forces, whether in North Africa or on the Eastern Front, came to understand that aerial resupply was becoming increasingly unreliable. This knowledge affected morale and tactical planning, as commanders could no longer count on receiving critical supplies by air. The sight of burning ME-323 aircraft became a symbol of German logistical failure and declining air power. For Allied forces, the successful interception of ME-323 formations provided both tactical and propaganda victories. Destroying a single transport formation could eliminate tons of enemy supplies, while simultaneously demonstrating Allied air superiority to both friend and foe. The dramatic visual impact of such massive aircraft being shot down was captured in gun camera footage and reconnaissance photographs, providing powerful evidence of Allied success. The legacy of the Messerschmitt ME-323 Gigant extends beyond its wartime service into post-war aviation development. The engineering lessons learned from designing and building such massive transport aircraft influenced later civilian and military transport programs. The concept of using multiple engines to achieve heavy lift capability became standard practice in post-war transport design, though with much greater emphasis on survivability and redundancy. Modern military transport aircraft like the Lockheed C-5 Galaxy and Antonov AN-124 owe conceptual debt to pioneering designs like the ME-323. Though they incorporate decades of additional development in areas like defensive systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and structural survivability. The basic challenge addressed by the ME-323, moving large amounts of cargo by air across significant distances, remains central to modern military logistics. The underwater wreck near La Maddalena, continues to attract research interest from marine archaeologists and aviation historians. Advanced underwater survey techniques have revealed details about the aircraft's construction and final moments that were previously unknown. The site serves as both a war grave and a research facility, providing insights into wartime aviation technology while honoring the memory of those who died aboard the aircraft. Environmental concerns have also become part of the wreck's story as researchers monitor the site for evidence of fuel or other contaminants leaking from the aircraft. The Mediterranean's relatively stable underwater conditions have preserved the wreck remarkably well, but 80 years of exposure to salt water have taken their toll on the aircraft's structure. Ongoing documentation efforts aim to record the wreck's current condition before further deterioration makes detailed study impossible. The story of the Messerschmitt MT-323 ultimately serves as a cautionary tale about the relationship between technological capability and strategic wisdom. The aircraft represented a genuine achievement in aviation engineering, demonstrating that German designers and manufacturers could create unprecedented flying machines when challenged to do so. The fact that they could design and build a successful six-engine transport aircraft capable of carrying such massive loads testified to the sophistication of German aviation technology. Yet this technological success was rendered meaningless by strategic and tactical failures that made the aircraft's capabilities irrelevant to the actual conditions of World War II. The assumption that such vulnerable transports could operate effectively in contested airspace proved fatally incorrect, while the decision to prioritize cargo capacity over survivability reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of modern aerial warfare requirements. The human tragedy embedded in this story cannot be overlooked. Every ME-323 that was shot down represented not just the loss of expensive equipment and critical supplies, but the deaths of trained aircrew members whose skills and experience were irreplaceable. These men died not in glory but in frustration, flying missions they knew were probably suicidal because military necessity demanded continued operations despite impossible odds. Today, as the last physical remnants of the ME-323 rest on museum shelves in Mediterranean seabeds, the aircraft's story serves as a reminder of both human ingenuity and human folly. The engineers who designed it and the workers who built it demonstrated remarkable technical capabilities, creating a flying machine that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with available technology. The crews who flew it displayed extraordinary courage, continuing to operate these vulnerable aircraft, even as losses mounted to unsustainable levels. The Messerschmitt ME-323 Gigant stands as perhaps the most vivid example of how technological achievement without strategic wisdom leads to tragedy. Its massive size and impressive capabilities made it one of the most remarkable aircraft of World War II, while its complete destruction in service made it one of the war's most complete failures. The giant that was supposed to carry German forces to victory instead carried them to defeat, leaving behind only fragments and underwater wrecks to tell the story of ambition, engineering, and ultimately catastrophic failure.